So I'd like to just, in connection with describing the experience of fascism, to tell you something about my own and that of Hungary. In 1920s, after a very brief Hungarian-Soviet communist rule, the Western powers, actually at that time mainly France, conspired to put it down, and in came an authoritarian, right-wing, semi-fascist leader in a name of Admiral Horthy. And he set about what was described later as the white terror, repression, and revenge against the previous left-wing regime. Later, this settled into just continuous repression, and there had been some racist laws passed. Hungary passed the first racist law in Europe, in fact, the so-called numerus clausus, which limited the number of people who could join professions. My father was studying medicine, and in 1 year he was declared surplus to requirements and had to do a year's study in Prague, in a German university there, which he thought was actually quite a nice experience. But still, he could return, and in these interwar years, there was general repression, but not full-blown fascism yet. But because Hungary lost territories in the First World War, Hitler bribed this right-wing regime into joining him on the attack to Russia, and or Soviet Union, in fact, in those days. And this went on all right for a short while, and then came the turn of Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk in 1942-43. It was clear Germany has lost the war. It was even clear to the Hungarian right-wing leadership. So they tried to start putting feelers out to the Western powers to negotiate terms for Hungary leaving the German alliance. However, the German intelligence was aware of this, and it was then that Germany invaded Hungary because it became an unreliable ally. This was March 1944. From that day on, the Jews in Hungary were in mortal danger. With the invading Germans came Eichmann, who set up his HQ in Budapest, and set about, with some enthusiastic help from the Hungarian right-wing regime, set about the deportation of Hungarian Jews, first from the countryside. 400,000 people by the summer of 1944 were transported to Auschwitz, 400,000. And amongst them was my own family who were farming in Transylvania. And Transylvania was returned as part of this bribe from Hitler to Hungary, and immediately their situation became worse. And 15 members of my family were then transported to Auschwitz, and only one came back. A young cousin, a teenage girl who was put to work in the warehouses of Auschwitz, sorting clothes after clothes that was left behind after the gas chambers. And at one day she had to sort her parents' clothes, so you can imagine the trauma of that. But she survived and came back. Also, when the Germans arrived, there was a whole series of increased penal legislation against Jews. First of all, had to wear the yellow star as a distinction and humiliation. And you had to wear a yellow star regardless of age. I myself, at age 7, was wearing a yellow star then. And also, you had to live in large yellow star-marked buildings, concentrated because of Jewish houses, a kind of archipelago of ghettos, really, basically. All this was clearly preparatory to further deportation. Fortunately, rather, the Budapest Jews were not immediately deported because there was international pressure by then. We are in 1944, towards the end of the war. And it was slowed down, and but things got worse when the ruler, the Admiral Horthy, declared Hungary to have left the German alliance without any kind of backing. Immediately he was arrested by the Germans. And then the extreme fascist groups, the so-called Arrow Cross, took over and greatly increased the danger to Jews. They were practically hunted within that period. They often arrested and taken to the shores of the Danube and shot straight into the river if they could find them. I was lucky. I was taken to a Red Cross protected home on false papers, and although we had difficult times and it was dangerous, we had by and large survived. The menfolk, the Jewish menfolk, were called up into kind of slave work details attached to the armies, the Hungarian and German army. And they were used as slaves, basically, had to wear a yellow armband, and they were used for digging trenches wherever, sometimes and most often on the Eastern Front, and to take up minefields, which were an incredibly dangerous job, and the survival rate was about 10%. One Hungarian poet by the name of Miklós Radnóti was also called up into these slave work detachments, and he was subjected to frequent death marches, which, when they were driven from place to place and the stragglers were routinely shot. He started off with his group in Serbia and right across the country ended up close to the Austrian border, where they shot him. And he was thrown into a mass grave, and this was only weeks before the Liberation Day, sadly. And his body was exhumed, and in his pocket they found blood-stained poems, his last poems. And I would like to read one of them, because it is a cry of warning about the nature of fascism. This is a poem called Fragment by Miklós Radnóti, translated by Zsuzsanna Ozsvát and Turner. In such an age I dwelt on earth, when men had fallen so beneath their nature that they, unbidden, for their lust would kill, and foaming stagger in the tangles of confusion, possessed by tainted creeds, bewildered by delusion. In such an age I dwelt on earth, when spies were honored and the murderer, the traitor, and the thief were held as heroes. But he whose zeal, it seemed, lacked voice and violence would be abhorred as if he bore a pestilence. In such an age I dwelt on earth, when he who would protest perforce must hide and gnaw his fist in bitterness and shame. The nation in its madness laughed and thought it good to taste such fatal horrors, drunk with filth and blood. In such an age I dwelt on earth, when to the child the mother was accursed. The woman who miscarried would rejoice. The live man envied the entombed and wormy dead, while on his table poison thickened, foamed, and spread. In such an age I dwelt on earth, when the dumb poet must wait and hold his peace, hope for the day when he might find voice. For none could here pronounce the dark, demanded verse but that Isaiah, master of the fitting curse. So I think it indicates the horrors, really, that were attendant in those days. And there is a family connection in that. My father himself was in one of these, was called up into one of these work details. And he was kept on the guard, along with others, in a camp on the outskirts of Budapest. And my mother and aunt, in a kind of improvised Red Cross uniform, went to this camp, bribed the armed guard, went in, called out their names, and pronounced that they are needed elsewhere, and took them out. I still wonder at the bravery, really, of these women. Eventually, my father, nonetheless, was transported to Bergen-Belsen, but survived and was transferred to Theresienstadt, and by the mid-summer of 45 liberated and came back to us, and we had no news of him until he appeared on the doorstep. But we were lucky that he came back. I just want to indicate that these were the pains of the Holocaust. And I just want to say how awful and terrible it is that it is the memory of the Holocaust that is being used as cover for what the Israeli state and the Zionists are doing today in Gaza. It is... It is through this incredible pain that undoubtedly Jews have suffered in the Holocaust of 1944-45 that somehow they appropriate and base their impunity, which they use all over the world, not only against the Palestinian people, first of all against the Palestinian people, but against any people around the Middle East. And I think this is a complete outrage. And I think that we should call it out, as we do with... I am part of a group that stands by the demonstrations with placards claiming that we are against the use of the Holocaust against Gaza. And I also add that any comparison with Nazi Germany and the actions of this Israeli government should not be a taboo. It is appropriate. And I think that our only response should be ever-growing numbers in these demonstrations to show that the people are against the direction of this government and what's happening in Gaza. Ever-growing numbers have electoral implications, and this cynical government would only respond to that, it seems. Free, free Palestine. Thank you very much.